Pay-per-view is one of the more interesting things in our business. And even the business of pay-per-view. Like, if you ever meet an expert in pay-per-view, you've now met a liar. Not kind of. It's like meeting an expert in cryptocurrency. You've now met a liar. You could have a guy that knows everything there is to know from the beginning about crypto, and if he discloses to you up front, man, this thing is changing constantly, there's really no such thing as an expert, let me tell you what I've learned. All right, now you're dealing with somebody honest, but it's very much the same thing in pay-per-view. And a lot of guys that become dreamers within the fight business, that is their ultimate landing point. How do I get to pay-per-view? What is it that I do to get to pay-per-view? How do I get in with these organizations, these companies that have satellites around the world and will broadcast my product on pay-per-view? I mean, it's one of these de creme sweet spots. And while I share with you that there's not a pay-per-view expert, but while I share with you there is so much of a phenomenon around pay-per-view. And it's just really interesting for me. I mean, this even started like at movie theaters, and it used to be called like these closed caption type things. And the way that you could get a pay-per-view was very much different than and isolated to commercial areas before it changed and became to residential and just became into people's homes. And then it became a massive fixture for entertainers that performed on pay-per-view, which really were two things: boxing and professional wrestling. But within not having anybody that could explain what pay-per-view is, we began to hear the term, and it began to become associated with certain things. And that's where the phenomenon of pay-per-view comes from. Like, for example, a boxer that would go out and make a whole bunch of money. I mean, you'd hear about it, and it would be advertised. It would be the biggest purses ever, and the biggest checks, and the most were exclusive to pay-per-view. So within your mind, over a period of time, you very easily and naturally will come to a conclusion about pay-per-view being the de creme. That's the sweet spot. That's where the money is. That's where the business is. Everything that I hear that does anything meaningfully financially, to the point that it goes out there and it gets advertised, is always associated with pay-per-view. And even though I don't really know what pay-per-view is, and even though there's not a book out there on pay-per-view, and even though there's no course or no class at any college that a tenured professor teaches on pay-per-view, I still know enough about pay-per-view to know that if you're on it, you do good business. And this really did get extended. It wasn't just the boxers. Vince McMahon would pay his headlining act of WrestleMania, which is on pay-per-view. You would get $1 million. It was never discussed. It wasn't part of the contract. Whether you walked first or you walked second, whether you got the 1, 2, 3 or you did the JOB, you were going to get a bonus check for $1 million. Now, don't apply that to the main event of a Saturday night's main event, which we should be on NBC. Don't apply that to Raw. Don't apply that to SmackDown. Don't apply it to anything. It is exclusive to Mania. It is exclusive to pay-per-view. Now, after a period of time, while perhaps not a guaranteed, even if unspoken, $1 million, the guys that did perform on pay-per-view were getting bonus checks. So as the word gets out, and even though nobody understands pay-per-view, even though nobody's got an expert, you don't have a consultant unless you have a well-dressed liar in the world of pay-per-view. Even if you don't have these things, the phenomenon is now created. And the phenomenon that the media has absorbed, so therefore they won't push back, that the public has absorbed, so therefore they won't ask any questions, and the phenomenon that the athletes themselves have aspired to, even though they really don't know what it is they're talking about, does become exclusive to pay-per-view. To go and do the same thing against the same person for the same rules and get the same outcome at the same weight class in the same venue for the same like it, you could make everything the same. It wasn't on pay-per-view. Not only will you not get then whatever that participation, whatever that gift that somebody being generous is giving away anyway, you wouldn't even expect it. There'd be no hard feelings. You wouldn't ask for it. If you got a fancy entertainment lawyer that does this all the time, as he's drawing up your contract, as soon as he finds out it's not on pay-per-view, he won't even ask for things that he would demand if it were on pay-per-view. It's a phenomenon. It's a very, very interesting one. And I've attempted to share with you inner workings of the BS that happens within combat sports. I went on Andrew Schultz's massive podcast. I couldn't believe how many people watched. Very successful. But I shared with him that the biggest boxing fight of all time is not something that you're going to get the answer to or revealed to you through a Google search. And he argued with me. He believed you could get that through a Google search. Look, it says right here, this is the top drawing boxing fight of all time. And I was trying to share, no, the number one boxing fight of all time, what Google is going to tell you, the number one boxing fight of all time is whoever put out the press release and lied about a higher number than a press release had previously lied about. There is no executive of any distribution company who has ever backed up a single claim that Floyd Mayweather has made. Just for example, I bring Floyd into it, it's just a name that you would know. And the idea and the phenomenon, I mean, I got to tell you, it really is a fascinating, wonderful thing, as though there's not revenue within a sport unless it's on pay-per-view, right? I mean, it's to that point with the phenomenon. The Los Angeles Lakers, which is a very successful franchise, the New York Yankees, which I trust that you guys have heard of, have never competed on pay-per-view. Ever. But the idea that you must be on pay-per-view to succeed as a television pro, like this idea lives on. It's unpenetratable. And when I tell you I'm interested in pay-per-view, like, it really is a gift to bring somebody in, if you're in the pay-per-view business, which is the hardest thing in the world, and you're only going to learn that through trial and error. And it's not going to be success followed by trophy. You're going to lose and lose and lose. And if you can hang on and learn enough and have enough resources that you can stay, someday you might make it. So the idea that you as a promoter are going to give that to your main event is a very generous, but it's also a very bizarre concept. I mean, it really is a very bizarre thing. I'm just going to gift them. I'm going to give them pay-per-view points. And then it becomes where the athletes themselves will start negotiating for it. Then they'll get mad at you if you don't give it to them. How dare you not give it to me? Which continues to the phenomenon that is the great revenue. That is how you make it. Never understanding the example that I gave you about the Lakers or the Yankees, who have never performed on pay-per-view. And I just offer that to you because Dana White did the Full Send podcast recently, which I thought was the name of Andrew Schultz's podcast, but it's not. Andrew Schultz's podcast is called Flagrant. Dana goes on Full Send, which is hosted by the Nelk Boys, but he beats around the bush while letting you know that these numbers that you're hearing on pay-per-view, 1.3, 1.5, 1.7, these numbers that you are hearing are not accurate. They are not true. And he could have gone into great detail as he knows that. He beat around the bush a little bit. But it is somewhat of a fascinating narrative. And the phenomenon and the ideas surrounding pay-per-view, when I tell you there's no expert and that you've never met an expert, it's one of those things that you've got to be very careful. Because if you get into that space, you are going to bring in consultants. Those consultants are going to come in, they're going to tell you that they understand it. And they could even impress you with a Rolodex. They could get somebody on Time Warner, they could get somebody on DirecTV on the phone and show that they've got relationships. But as far as being an expert within the space, start with this. Tell me what people do wrong. Tell me of all the things that are on pay-per-view that don't make it, or all the things that try to get on pay-per-view and never get the shot in the first place. Tell me what their mistake is. Tell me what they're doing wrong. And your consultant and your expert won't be able to do that because he was lying in the first place and he never expected for you to ask him a question in that direction. Now, an expert would be able to tell you very quickly. And it's a very interesting idea that I never cease to enjoy. I never cease to enjoy when I hear the numbers come out that something flopped or something hit it out of the park based on a pay-per-view number that was made up in the first place. And I don't know how important that is to you. I don't know. But I do know to have records is something very prestigious. I know there's a level of prestige, which is why the person is deeming it important to tell the lie in the first place. It just seems as though we as a community are going to keep track of things, and we're going to use the term biggest fights, and we're going to celebrate biggest fights, that we would use a quantifiable number that could be proved. Your live gate, just for example. And then now we can have a debate on which one do we want to argue over. Do we want to argue over gross dollars brought in, or do we want to bring asses in seats? They're both very meaningful, but over a period of time with inflation, you're going to see where one can be distorted and one can't. It's an interesting thing. I like that Dana had pointed out that what you're being told is not true. I hope that you understand. When I tell you the biggest boxing fight of all time is whoever lied in a press release the day after the event, stronger than the person who had previously lied in a press release the day after the event. I think that it would smarten you to the business just a little. And I think the phenomenon and the ideas that get brought in with it. Here's where your bonus is going to be, but your bonus will only be here. Which adds to a belief system that that's the only way to actually make it. And that goes back to the late 80s when the term pay-per-view was spoken for the very first time. And it is a really interesting phenomenon. But the myth of people in today's world, as soon as we went to something called digital, and I have no idea why they call the internet digital. I don't know why they don't just call it the internet. I don't know where the word digital or streaming. You're a complete nerd if you say those things. But the moment those things came along, pay-per-view as you knew it or as you understood it or as you falsely knew it and falsely understood it changed dramatically. And people that were in the pay-per-view business all of a sudden got a lot looser with who could come in on pay-per-view, what thresholds would be on pay-per-view, what standards were going to be prerequisites to your contract extending to pay-per-view. It got a lot looser. It got looser because the business had drastically changed. And while you don't know the business, and there's no one that you could meet, there is not an expert out there in pay-per-view. There is one thing that is absolutely true, and you should have been able to connect those on your own, which is that the house always wins.